The issue of Indigenous rights in the film industry is an ongoing and complicated one. Representation of Indigenous people in film has historically been fraught with stereotypes and inaccuracies, and the Indigenous community has long been overlooked and underrepresented. While strides have been made in recent years to correct this imbalance, more work needs to be done to ensure proper representation and to make sure Indigenous voices are heard in the film industry. The issue of Indigenous rights in the film industry is not one that happened overnight. In fact, the representation of Indigenous people in films has been historically limited, often depicted in a negative light, and often completely absent. This lack of representation has caused a great deal of harm to Indigenous communities, as well as to the film industry as a whole. In recent years, however, there have been some positive changes. Indigenous people are increasingly being cast in major roles and are being featured in more films than ever before. This increased representation of Indigenous people in films has had a hugely positive effect on the film industry, as well as on the Indigenous community itself. The increased representation of Indigenous people in films has helped to create more accurate and balanced portrayals of Indigenous people. This has allowed for more accurate and respectful depictions of Indigenous people and their cultures in films, and has helped to create a more inclusive and respectful environment for Indigenous people in the film industry. In addition to increased representation, there have also been some efforts to give Indigenous people more control over their own stories and the stories of their culture. The Canadian film A Two Indians Talking is an example of this, as it was written and produced by two First Nations filmmakers. This has allowed Indigenous people to tell their stories in their own words, and to create films that represent their culture and their experiences in a more authentic and meaningful way. Finally, there has also been an increased focus on Indigenous rights in the film industry in recent years. This has included calls for more Indigenous filmmakers and more Indigenous-led projects, as well as increased support for Indigenous filmmakers and their projects. In summary, Indigenous rights in the film industry have come a long way in recent years. There is still a long way to go, however, before true equality is achieved. It is essential that the film industry continues to make progress in this area, and that Indigenous voices continue to be heard and respected. Only then can true representation and true equality be achieved in the film industry.